Um, okay, so hi everyone. I'm here today with Toste Tanhua, who is a scientist who works with Team Militia. Toste, can you just tell us a little bit about where you're from and your background and the work you do with Militia?
Yeah, hi, Will. I'm Tosse Tanhua. I'm a chemical oceanographer working at Geomar Ocean Center for Ocean Research in Kiel in Germany. And I've been in contact with Boris for about 3 years now and supporting his science ambitions.
Perfect. So today we're going to have a quick look at the science data that was collected by Boris during the Vendée Globe. As we know, he had the ocean map on board, and we're going to have a quick look at some of the data. So firstly, what we have here is the environmental CO2. So this is the CO2 that was measured underneath the boat constantly as they sailed around the world. So we're going to look at a couple of features. So firstly, on the descent down the Atlantic, we can see that there was a slight increase in the CO2 here, which was roughly when he was sailing through Storm Theta. Maybe we could have a little explanation as to why that happened there.
That is very interesting. So CO2 concentration is always higher as you go down in the water column away from the surface, where basically you have respiration or breathing of organism. And a storm like Theta brings normally up the water from below to the surface, so you get that what we call upwelling. And you see that in higher concentrations of carbon dioxide, particularly compared to when the return track was 80 days later or 70 days later.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to see the huge difference between the track back up the Atlantic. Not sailing through a tropical storm makes a big difference.
It does, yeah.
Another interesting point to look at is as they were sailing past the coast of Brazil, firstly down the Atlantic and back up. Can you explain to us a little bit about why it was so much higher CO2 in the water here?
So there's something we very often see around the equator. So you have what we call equator upwelling. So water again is coming from a couple of 100 meters depth, coming up to the surface. And that is where we normally have outgassing. The carbon dioxide goes from the ocean to the atmosphere in this region. So that's very well.
Yeah. And finally, we had obviously we have the Southern Ocean track where Boris spent more than half the race sailing in the Southern Ocean conditions, and there was firstly quite a big difference between the region south of South Africa and then over around New Zealand, and then finally there's a bit of a difference around the Falkland Islands bit. Can you explain a little bit about that? The differences?
Yeah, so what drives the carbon dioxide flux is a lot of biology production. And in the southern hemisphere, we had summer. So all the algae are growing and drawing down the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and growing their cell structure, basically. That is why we see low carbon dioxide south of Africa in the Indian Ocean. However, the algae needs more than carbon dioxide to grow. They need iron and nutrients, and that is lacking in the Southern Ocean. And that's why probably that you see kind of high concentration south of Australia in the Pacific. And then again, when we get east of South America around Falkland Islands, we have really low concentrations of carbon dioxide. And Boris was observing green water rather than blue water, very high productivity. The algae are really growing and sucking all the carbon dioxide out of the water right there.
No, that's really interesting to hear and to understand why we see these differences during his journey around the world, and to understand these, especially in these more remote areas of the Southern Pacific, where there's hardly been any data collected for this area before. So. But Boris wasn't only collecting CO2 data measurements in the water as he was going around. We also were measuring the temperature of the water. So it's always interesting to see what conditions Boris might have been experiencing. But there's two obvious features you can see here. All the way in the Southern Ocean, the temperature was roughly around between 0 and 10 degrees water temperature, which you really wouldn't want to go for a swim in that. That's pretty cold conditions to be in. And then also we can see up in the Atlantic, when he was sailing in the regions of the tropics, he had much warmer conditions of up to 25 and in some cases even 30 degrees water temperature. So that's obviously close to the equator, where there's a lot more sunlight and obviously a lot more heating of the water there. Finally, we had the salinity as well. Boris was measuring the salinity of the water, and it's really interesting to finally look at this track with the completed lap to look at the differences between the oceans. So we can notice there's a big difference between the Atlantic Ocean, which tends to have much higher salinity. So that's kind of this region here. Oh, much higher salinity than say the Pacific regions, and also south of Australia over here as well. But can you explain to us the differences we see in the salinity?
It's very typical that we have high salinity in the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean is even higher, of course. So that has to do with the circulation of the surface currents and the deep currents of the ocean. And interesting enough, you see also that in the tropics, in the Atlantic, or close to the equator, in the doldrums, there is actually lower salinity because it actually rains a lot, and that fresh water tends to stick on or stay on top of the salt water because it's high, lower density. And it's interesting enough, also around South Africa, you see that high salinity there coming from the Agulhas current.
Yeah.
You saw that also in temperature. And Boris, as he sailed through there, was going in and out of that Agulhas current. And it probably caused a little bit of rough seas as well, that counter current coming in there.
No, it's very interesting to understand some of the differences in the ocean currents and the ocean masses that we see that Boris has been sailing in, and by collecting this data, we get such a deeper insight as to what kind of he was experienced as he was sailing around the world. Some things we wouldn't have even known if he hadn't been measuring as he was sailing around. But no, thank you very much for explaining some of the main features we can see of this data. Hopefully it will be used when it gets sent to the SOCAT database and is able to be shared amongst other scientists. But yeah, no, thanks for your explanation. And is there anything else you want to add about some of the science that Boris was doing during the Vendée Globe?
So the reason that Boris is making carbon dioxide measurements is that the ocean takes up about a third of the carbon dioxide emissions. So before the industrial time, there was 280 in the atmosphere, ppm. Now it's 410. So that whole range that Boris is measuring from deep red, 200 years ago, the whole ocean was in deep red. Now it's actually in the green. And if the ocean didn't take up that carbon dioxide, we would have 80 ppm higher carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we have a really strong global warming. So these data are really useful for understanding how that dynamics in the ocean works and how much the carbon is being taken up and where and when.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it's so useful to understand how much the ocean is important to us in our impact on climate change. So great. Thanks for your explanation, Toste, and yeah, good to speak to you. Thanks.
Bye-bye.